Morning. So, on the Daily Show page on YouTube, they uploaded a clip from something Trevor Noah did recently, I guess. I don't know if it's a new segment he did or if they just uploaded it recently, but it was up on their YouTube page recently, called The Talk. And I want to be careful here about how I go about this, but this is just kind of my reaction and my thought process to that video, and I'll put a link to the video in the description and some other sources of information I'm going to talk about. But generally, the gist of the video is people in the Black American community have to have a talk with their children about how to deal with the police because of disproportionate enforcement action, use of force, and deadly force against people in the Black American community, right? So, and they go into, a bunch of statistics. Okay, so we're talking about meta-level data. We're not talking necessarily about specific instances, although every time we talk about this subject, you get the specific and the generalized conflated, right? And you gotta be careful about separating the two. So if Trevor Noah or anybody else wants to talk about a specific use of force, we can talk about the relative merits of that use of force or not, right? But if we're going to talk about statistical level data, that is generalized rates of behavior, whether it's about the police or anybody else, then let's talk about the general, okay? And they go into, like I said, a bunch of statistics, and therefore, because of this disproportionate rate of behavior, it justifies a elevated level of fear and suspicion and mistrust of the police, right? Fear, suspicion, and mistrust. And in fact, they talk about parents having this conversation with children as young as 8, about how, you don't trust the police. The police are more likely to kill you because of the color of your skin. And so here's how you behave around the police, right? And there's this one part, and I think it's towards the end of the video, this 8-year-old girl who's clearly been, drilled on, having her hands up and saying, my name is little girl, and I am unarmed and not a threat to you, and, whatever, right? So, clearly they not just once had this conversation, but, they've been over it repeated times to where she could, respond in a kind of, predetermined manner when she encounters the police, right? So here's the thing, right? If you posit that because of a disproportionate rate of behavior, in this case by the police, it justifies a greater sense of fear, suspicion, distrust of the police, then what you're saying is, if you have a disproportionate outcome, that justifies an elevated response. Which I'm not sure they want to actually have that argument. Okay? If you look at, since we're talking about statistics, since they raised the point of statistics and disproportionate rates of behavior, okay, then we have to be able to have the conversation in the opposite direction, right? So, for example, and I'll link the FBI Uniform Crime Report, okay, which is the most complete data set that we have on, for example, law enforcement officers killed in action, right? Or LEOKIA, right? And so between, I think it's like 2013 and 2019 or something like that, but a 5 to 10 year period, okay? They track all sorts of statistical information on the reporting agencies. It's 60-some% of reporting agencies in the country. So that covers the overwhelming majority of law enforcement agencies, but okay, officers who are killed in the line of duty. Okay, we have demographic information on the individuals who perpetrated those crimes. Now, in those given years, and like I said, I think it's 13 to 19, but I mean, just, on average, okay, Black Americans, who constitute 15% of the population or so, account for about, on average, 37% of the law enforcement deaths, right? And again, they brought up the statistics, right? They wanted to talk about broad rates of behavior and disproportionate outcomes. Okay, Trevor Noah did. So, if we're going to talk about it, then let's have that conversation, right? And if the disproportionate use of force by police justifies fear, distrust, apprehension around law enforcement officers, does the disproportionate use of deadly force by that segment of the population against police officers also, since they posited it, justify fear, apprehension, mistrust? Does it? I'm not saying it does. I'm asking the question, right? Because they raised the issue. Trevor Noah did. That's what I mean when I say they, right? And now, folks on that side of the argument might say, well, that is a reaction to a disproportionate use of force by the police. Okay? So, we can, maybe get into, who started it, right? Or what the history is. But, generally speaking, when we're talking about law enforcement, okay? And again, we're talking about broad rates of behavior. We're not talking about the specific. You want to have the specific, that's a separate conversation, right? But, generally speaking, okay, law enforcement is there to enforce laws and reacts to what they're presented with, right? So, are they reacting to deadly force with deadly force when they're there because they've been asked to be there? Law enforcement. Again, just questions to consider since they raised the subject. Okay? And if disproportionate use of force, disproportionate rates of deadly force against one group or the other justifies an elevated level of fear, mistrust, and apprehension, is one group more justified than the other? Does one group more disproportionately use deadly force against the other per capita, right? When we say per capita, we mean per 100,000. So we're trying to get a fair comparison, right, per rate of behavior for, an equal amount of population, because there are more black people in the country than there are cops, right? There's something like 50 million black people-ish in the U.S., and there's something like 700,000 cops in the U.S., right? So you have to normalize for, rates of death between the two. Okay? And in a given year, police may kill total around 250 black people, okay? At a higher level than would account for their population, right? About 15% of the population. And the total deaths by police account for around 25%, right? Police kill, on average, about 1,000 people a year, depending on who's counting, right? And maybe a quarter of that is black people, okay? So, we've got that data, but we also got on the other side, right? Like I said, black people account for 37% on average, right? So, say in 2019, it was about 20 of the felonious deaths among police officers caused by a black suspect. So, and if you normalize, again, per capita, per 100,000, okay, you have about 0.4 black people killed by police, okay, and that's all. That's not unarmed, that's all. So that's, maybe questionable use of force, certainly justified use of force. All black people, it's around 250, right, out of 1,000. And then in 2019, in the same year, you had around 20 law enforcement officers killed by black assailants, right? So 0.4 per 100,000 black people killed by police, and then 4 over 700,000, or 2.8 per 100,000 law enforcement officers killed by a black suspect. So another way to look at that, right? 0.4 versus 2.8. Okay, so in a given encounter for that year, when an officer encountered a black suspect, the officer was roughly 7 times more likely to die in that encounter than the black suspect. Now, if Trevor Noah wants to argue that the disproportionate rate of behavior justifies an elevated level of fear, mistrust, and apprehension on the part of the black community around police officers, is the statistical observation that officers were 7 times more likely to be killed by the black person than vice versa in a given encounter justify an elevated level of fear, mistrust, and apprehension? I would say no. However, the argument being advanced by Trevor Noah and The Daily Show would seem to suggest otherwise. And I don't think you can have it both ways, right? If one justifies one, then surely you must admit that the other justifies the other, right? And it's not just 15% of the population, right? That's all black people in the country, right? Again, we have good statistical data. Go ahead and look at the FBI Uniform Crime Report, because it's not 8-year-old girls, right? Generally, it's males. Far and away, it's males, right? That are killed by the police, that kill police. Far and away, it's males in a certain age bracket, right? It's not 8-year-old males being killed by police, and it's not 8-year-old males killing police. It's men aged roughly 18 to 35, right? Some outliers either side of that, by gender, by age. But generally, that's the demographic, right? So it's really not 15% of the population counting for 37% on average of law enforcement deaths. It's more like 5%, right? That specific slice of that population. And so does it justify having the talk over and over with an 8-year-old girl about how to interact with the police? Especially considering, and if you look at, CDC data on the most common cause of death for all children in the country, it's things like, accidental injury, congenital birth defects, cancer, and self-harm, right? And again, disproportionate rates of behavior, okay? And who is more likely to be the victim of a violent action, and who's more likely to be the perpetrator, right? And those statistics get cited all the time. But I'm not throwing that in the face of anyone, including Trevor Noah, so much as to ask the question that if you're having this talk repeatedly with an 8-year-old girl, are you that much more often having a talk about how to deal with other dangerous individuals in her life who are far more likely to cause her some sort of harm? If that's the argument you want to advance, that the disproportionate rate of behavior justifies an increased level of fear, suspicion, and apprehension around that person, then are they really being consistent about the argument they're making, or is it that they have a political axe to grind, right? That it's convenient to use the police as a scapegoat for whatever other social problems that particular community faces. And I don't mean to minimize those problems. Everybody has problems, and some communities have, certainly outsized problems for their population, and those deserve a serious amount of investigation and thought and concern and effort to remedy. But are we putting our efforts in the right place? I don't know. What do you think? Take a look at the statistics. Drop a comment below. Disagree with me. Am I off base? Is my math wrong? Let me know. It's been fun, inspiring, and uplifting as always. See you on the next one.